I really don't care what business you're in. You're in the relationship business if you're in leadership.
One of the things that I've heard you speak about is your willingness to really invest in your people.
Every CEO, every employer has to really care for and talk about the importance of financial planning with their employees. I really only like to talk about 3, maybe 4 things. Money, religion, politics, and sports. That's why I haven't been invited to a party in nearly 40 years.
Welcome back to CEO Behind the Scenes. I'm Lara Necessian, and today we're exploring leadership through the lens of financial security, not just for executives, but for every employee across the workforce. My guest is Marc Cadin, CEO of Finseca, the organization formed from the integration of 8 nonprofits into one unified voice for financial security professionals. What I found so fascinating about this conversation was Marc's perspective when it comes to leadership and investing in people, particularly during periods of volatility. In this episode, we delve deep into how Marc scales that philosophy across an entire profession and so much more. Marc, welcome to the show.
Laura, so great to be with you. I can't wait for the discussion.
Where I really wanted to start with this conversation was looking back to something that you said, which was placing the importance on choosing the right mentor. And I would love if you could take us back to Flint Hill School. I'm curious to know what your role as a teacher and a coach, how that influenced the way that you really show up and lead today.
Well, I haven't talked about Flint Hill in some time, but that was my first job out of college. I was going to be a teacher and a coach for the rest of my life. And, I had this mentor, his name was Win Palmer. And Win gave me a couple of bits of advice that, 30 plus years later, I still rely on literally every day. And as a new sort of 22-year-old fresh into the workforce, there were a lot of people who were in the administration, in the department I was in, and there were a couple of individuals. One was sort of an older gentleman, very funny, a little irreverent, and somebody I just naturally gravitated towards. But then there was another person, her name was Teresa Ramundi, and she was quieter, studious, and professional. And I remember Win sitting me down one day and saying, "You know what, Marc, there's nothing more important than picking the right mentors. And I see you gravitating to this other older gentleman, and I know he's funny and he's a great guy and everybody loves him. But do you see that?" And he pointed at Teresa. "Do you see her? She's a professional." And that really had a powerful impact on me because, when you're younger in the workforce, you don't really know. You're sort of learning, you're gaining experiences, but I just have always found the right mentors have helped me make better decisions, have helped me see things clearly, finding people that are just a little ahead in their journey and that can help show you the way when there's so much uncertainty that surrounds us. The other bit of advice Win gave me was, I was also a coach. I was a varsity lacrosse coach. I played lacrosse in college. And, our team, frankly, wasn't great. And I remember complaining to Win, the players can't catch, they're not running, they're not working hard enough, they're not playing in the system, they're not showing up on time for practice. I had all these complaints. And Win looked me dead in the eye and he said, "Who's in charge? Who's in charge?" And I was like, whoa, that's pretty powerful. And I said, "Well, I guess I am. I was the head coach." And he said, "Then do something about it." And those two things for me, the idea of picking the right mentors and always thinking about personal responsibility first, and that's really what shapes a good leader, somebody that's willing to take the responsibility for changing the environment, the situation, the team, whatever it happens to be, take personal responsibility first in order to do that. And I think if you have that combination of great mentorship and you're willing to look inward first before you look externally, it gives you just a competitive advantage, I think, over 90+% of the workforce.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting to hear your perspective on that, because I could imagine that hearing these pieces of wisdom at such an early stage of your career would have had an inevitable impact on the way that you choose to lead and the way that you are able to take on that responsibility in the position of CEO today. And I'm curious, like, those pieces of wisdom, how do you believe that they still influence the way that you are able to take on that level of accountability and responsibility as CEO?
Well, I think, you mentioned in the outset, we've brought together, integrated, merged 8 different nonprofits. In our space, we represent kind of financial planners, financial security professionals. Until we did our first merger 5 years ago, literally the entire sector was filled with organizations breaking apart into smaller, more segmented groups. And as I think about how we did that, I think first you had to have a vision. What could be possible? And, I had spent a lot of time in this space before coming CEO and before doing any of these mergers, just talking to people who were around when the organization that represented this profession was much, much, much larger. It was more unified. And, that was, sort of the value of good mentorship. And I had another, individual who's on our board, who's made a huge impact on me, Mike James, who sat me down and said, "You know what, Mark, your job," and this was 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, "your job is to bring people together. That's your job as running a trade association, representing a profession. You are in a unique position to bring people together." And I just thought, wow, that's really powerful. And so that sort of became a big part of my cause. And then, this notion of taking personal responsibility, when you're bringing together nonprofits, it's different than doing a for-profit merger where there are economics involved. And, a lot of times the for-profit entities come together because of the economics. For us, it was all about persuasion. And I've always found the ability to persuade starts by really listening to people. It's so easy to say, but do you really genuinely and authentically listen to what people really care about? Not just the words they say, but how they say them. And that real deep listening, as we're trying to, herd the proverbial cats together towards a common mission, that has been so valuable for me. So I think just about every day, I don't always live that advice Win Palmer gave me all those years ago. It's hard. It's easier to say. It's harder to do. But I think just having that front and center is a powerful, powerful lesson. And it's really helped us create the Finseca that you see today.
One of the things that you've spoken about is, merging these different organizations together. And I could imagine that they would have had competing interests, competing priorities, perhaps competing visions, even in terms of what they wanted to create. How did the power of listening, or was there something else that you really did from a leadership lens in order to really bring these 8 different businesses together and to have this really cohesive, overarching strategy and vision, and having these different organizations singing from the same hymn book, so to speak?
We talk all the time about the power of relationships, and I really don't care what business you're in. You're in the relationship business if you're in leadership, and building high trust, low maintenance, quality relationships that move based on trust. One of the people that I've had just an enormously close relationship is Bonnie Godsman. Bonnie was the CEO of Gamma. She and I did the first merger between the organizations. We worked hand in glove together. Our relationship helped foster other relationships. And, I think the biggest thing that you have to overcome when you're doing mergers is really the cultural dynamic. I think the overarching vision for different segments of the profession we represent here at Finseca are pretty similar. They want to, no matter how you go to market, Financial professionals want to serve their clients. They want to help them become more financially secure by getting them the right advice, the right products. That overarching vision for different segments, I think, is pretty consistent. But the cultural differences in dynamics and the trust and the different roles within the supply chain, those are really different. So if you don't have those relationships, it becomes much, much harder. And even though I didn't start with relationships, Bonnie and I had a close relationship, but, we represent, 12,000 plus members now. I don't have a relationship with all 12,000 of our members. But I think if you have that core set of relationships and that is a priority for you, where you truly value the customer that you're here to represent, I think that authenticity comes through. I think people can see it. I think they can feel it. I think they understand. It shows up in terms of the people you hire, the people you promote, the people you recognize when you're about the customer, when you're about who you are serving. I just think that comes through. And so that's the ability to scale relationships. But it starts with, you got to make sure you have a core group of people who you believe in and who really believe in you.
Absolutely. And when you were bringing together these 8 different nonprofits together, what was the thought process behind that decision and seeing something that these 8 combined businesses together would be more powerful than had they been continuing to operate independently? What was the thought process that went behind that decision making?
Lots and lots and lots of organizations out there who are smaller operate with the perception of control, right? So they think they have control because they have a smaller organization. It feels more comfortable. I think the perception of control can be the biggest detriment in many instances to any business, regardless of who they are. So what we had to do was show that scale matters and the ability to truly advance this cause that inspired our name. We picked the name Finseca. It's inspired by this notion of financial security for all. So in order to advance that cause, that's a big, big, big cause, financial security for all. What we had to do is we had to help show what can you do with scale that you can't do as a smaller, more controlled organization. You can hire, your access to the talent pool goes up obviously considerably if you have that. And so that was a big part of it. And I think the other dynamic is that, we're a global business, but in the United States, you have a lot of pressure on how people access financial advice. So if you have money, really in the United States or anywhere around the world, if you have money, you really don't have a problem accessing financial advice. If you're buying a life insurance or annuity product or you're investing assets, there are lots of financial planners who want to work with people who have money. The real trick is, and this is what we need scale in order to advance the cause of financial security for all, how can we open up access for more people to really get the financial advice they need to become more financially secure? We've done a lot of research, a lot of polling, a lot of thought process about policies, and it's more important than ever before because in the United States and all around the world, government after government after government are really struggling with the demographic shifts that are happening in this country and the pressure on the social safety nets. And so it's going to require more private sector solutions. We need to get more people saving earlier, saving the right way. So as we started to talk through these different dynamics, these are big macro issues that impact how people in the United States and all over the world consume financial advice. And so the only way to truly impact that is with scale. And at the same point, we had to show people that, going back to relationships and listening, that what they cared about with their predecessor organization was going to be preserved. So we had to demonstrate that we cared and could fulfill the need that they had, while at the same time painting a bigger picture and a bigger vision about what we could do together that the smaller organizations couldn't do on their own.
And how did you go about showing the care? Because it is one thing to say that an organization cares. It's another thing to really show that and demonstrate. How did you go about doing that from a more practical perspective?
So I think it comes down to governance. Who do you put on your board? Are you serious about it being inclusive and representing every segment of the profession? The different organizations had meetings, they had brands, they had products and services that they required. And so you literally have to go through every segment of the business and evaluate, okay, how much does this matter to the people who it impacts? What's the profitability of that, business? What's the cost of maintaining separate brands? So I think the reason why, particularly in the nonprofit space, mergers don't happen that often is because you have to go through all these different segments while you maintain your core business and running the business while you evaluate it. And most people sort of go through that process on the nonprofit side where there is no dollar figure at the end of the day for employees, board members, et cetera. There's not an economic motive at the end of the day to bring together nonprofits. It's really a mission and a cause. It's can we do something better for society by coming together and working together? But you still have to go through all that due diligence, all that process. And if you don't, you may get a temporary win by bringing these groups together. But again, there's nothing that stops groups from splintering back out. It's not about bringing together these organizations one time. It's about keeping them together so that you can continue to grow the movement and you can operate with greater scale. And that just requires a lot of people doing a lot of work about having a bunch of conversations about what people care about. And if you do that well, though, and you're committed to the value of bringing people together to advance a bigger cause, then you have the ability to make that change durable. And that's really what we're trying to do here at Finseca.
In my previous experiences, I've undertaken mergers and acquisitions at scale. And there does become a point where you realize where it's so much bigger than just the structural changes that you're making. The structural changes are one element of it. But I would love to hear from your perspective. Was there a moment or some instances where you realized this is so much bigger than just making the structural changes, whether it was to do with the people, the cultural side of things? Could you speak to your experience around that?
I think that when people went from defining what us and them or what we was, people would say we, and they would mean their previous organization. They would mean one of the predecessor organizations. And one of the things, I believe in the power of words. They really matter. And so when people started to say we and they pronounced Finseca, that was, I think, the inflection point. Because I do think, Laura, you said it really well. The culture is actually much harder than the structure, the product offerings, the allocation of resources on a budget. Like those things are all intellectual. Culture is all about heart. And do you have people's hearts and minds? Do you have their soul? Are they truly invested? And that can be at a governance level at the board. That can be your customers or our members. It's the employees. It's the leadership team. It took us probably 3 or 4 years before we had almost everybody in the organization saying we, referring to Finseca rather than the previous one. The byproduct of that, by the way, we picked the name Finseca. I'm so glad you pronounced it correctly, because a lot of times I'll come in and people say Finska or Finseca, or there's all kinds of different, we kind of picked a funny name because we wanted it to be inspired by a cause, financial security for all. But, a couple of my goals early on and after the merger and the integrations was I wanted most of the people who worked for us and who we represented to be able to pronounce our name correctly. Like that was a big early goal those are little things, but they actually matter, like you don't mispronounce your own last name because your own last name matters to you, right?
I was wondering whether you could share, was there a particular moment that felt particularly challenging in that merger journey? Was there a moment, whether it was, the name was the starting point, but was there other cultural challenges or people-related challenges, or even a particular example that you can recall on that felt like a particularly challenging moment to be in that CEO position?
Well, one of the things I always say, I never use the term acquisition because I just don't think any human being wants to be acquired. And in the end, businesses are not static things that you see on a piece of paper or on a TV or whatever. Businesses are people, right? Every business in America, every business around the world is made up of people. So I always think like integrations are a much better word for bringing people together, because that's what bringing two businesses together are. It's not a hierarchy of power. It's about what we can do together. But one of the things with our first integration, the organization I was at ALU. Gamma was where Bonnie Godsman, who was the CEO there. And one of the first things you had to do was choose who was going to be a CEO. And both Bonnie and I both said both of us were willing to give up the CEO role. Bonnie was more persuasive about wanting to give up the CEO role than I was. And so, we agreed that I would be the CEO and she would serve as president of the organization. And we worked through that pretty well, but the governance structure and the customer base, where there was a lot of brand loyalty, they didn't really, it wasn't as quick for them. So early on, there was a lot of people looking at me and saying, can we trust you? You are part of the other organization. Do you really care about us and our cause and our mission? And as we brought additional organizations in, we brought additional CEOs to the table. We had to integrate additional employees. And so as we went through that process, every time you did that, there is this dynamic where, as the CEO, not everybody always trusted me. I sort of came from, in their mind, the other team. And so it just required, that's where, again, I think the importance of language really matters. This notion of, everybody matters. What we're trying to do is bring people together, how we conduct ourselves, how we show up, how I showed up, how I talked about all of the different segments of the profession, not just the one that I spent the most time with before we created Finseca, really, really mattered. So, I think that's the way that you have to show up. It's also was complex about, being a CEO of a smaller organization is different than being a senior executive in a larger organization. And so we had to have some of those tough conversations too, because at the same point, you have to chart the course forward. You have to drive more value. If you bring all these organizations together and deliver less value to the subparts, to the segments, then you're not going to be able to keep it as a sustainable business. So you have to both have some of those tougher conversations about competencies and roles. And we've done a couple of different, we did an optimization of the leadership team. We did a restructure. Not everybody and that was with the predecessor organizations could make it through to the other side, because you needed a different skill set and you needed an effective leadership team that had all the right pieces. But if you do it with, the right language, the right spirit in your heart, a consistent and intentional communication style, I don't think there's anything you can't overcome, but it just requires a lot of energy and effort to make sure you maintain those relationships through some of the tougher times.
And I could imagine how that change management piece would have been so challenging at that time, to bring on new people and bring them on board to a new way of doing things, to a new leader, to a new structure. A really big theme that I've picked up on through this conversation is your care and attention to people, whether it's listening to people, whether it is making the extra concerted effort to connect with people, that has paid off in a big way over time, because that is genuine and that is something that can't be faked for a short period of time. It's something that you need to live by example over a sustained period of time. One of the things that I've heard you speak about is your willingness to really invest in your people and mentor people, even when they are uncomfortable conversations to have, and even when it's uncomfortable to be on the receiving end of that mentorship or that feedback. Could you speak to how that has really transcended and how that plays out in your leadership style and the types of conversations you have?
Well, listen, I'm going to take that last clip. I'm going to cut it and I'm going to send it both to my mother and to my wife, because maybe those might have been the nicest things anybody's ever said to me. So thank you for that. I would just say, like, I think at first it starts with being self-aware. One thing I am certain of, there's going to be nobody who has ever worked with me, for me, that I've worked for, that would accuse me of being a saint. Nobody is. I have plenty of flaws, and I think that's a big part, I think, of the ability to connect with people. I think human beings connect with other human beings first, foremost, through shared vulnerability. I think leaders, I wish I was one of those leaders that had, was sort of like invincible and like always had the right answer and always had the right words to say and the right temperament and the right level of patience. But I have lots and lots and lots of flaws that I work on every single day. And I think that's a little bit a part of how we've been able to, do what we've done, which, no other organization in Washington, D.C. or anywhere that I'm aware of has ever brought together this many nonprofits. And because I think that understanding that self-awareness first, again, going back to what Win Palmer told me all those years ago, first looking within. I think then, but you do have to be intentional in terms of how you engage with your people. As we brought together different organizations, we needed different competencies at different times over the course of the last 5 years. And you have to not only have a competency, but you also need to have a fire in the belly. What we're doing is hard. We're building an organization. And by the way, we launched the organization during COVID, which is part of my New Year's resolutions in 2021. I said, I am never launching another organization and doing a merger during COVID ever again in my life. I will not do it. But like that also added a bunch of challenges. We had meetings and conventions and all this stuff was part of our product line. And so that stuff went away. And then we had the complexity of dealing in the post-COVID world. The dynamics just continued to evolve. But I think if you're self-aware as a leader and you're willing to look within, okay, what are the things I'm really good at? What are the things I'm passionate about? And what are the competencies and skills do I need around me that's going to help me be the best version of myself? And I think then you have the ability to put people in place. And the other thing, just going back to your question, Laura, I think the idea for me as a leader, like I believe in everybody has unlimited possibilities. I truly believe growth is a choice. It's not going to fit. You're not going to have every person fit every job in every moment. But I do believe that as human beings, I think we sell ourselves far short, generally speaking, in terms of what we're capable of. And if you think about anybody that's ever accomplished anything, they've always had somebody who thought that they could do more than what they themselves thought. And that's the power of mentorship, the ability of stretching and growing. And we're filled with self-doubt always. And so when you have somebody that says, you know what, you can be more, you can do more, and that push people to stretch and grow and take on new responsibilities. And if you have somebody with the grit who's willing to do that, there's no limit to what you can accomplish. And what I've found is despite my abundant amount of flaws, the fact that I do genuinely care about the people I work with and want to see them be more successful than they themselves might see themselves, I think that gives me a lot of grace with all the things I screw up on a daily basis that I'm not good at, because people know that I genuinely want to see them succeed and them do more.
So I wanted to circle back to one of the earlier points that we were talking about, which is you mentioned this piece around financial advisors not actually being a perk for employees, but something that is more accessible to people, especially those who don't have the financial resources to perhaps invest in a financial advisor. And you really believe in this as a philosophy and a principle. So I'm wondering, could you speak to your perspective on that and why you believe it's so important that this forms part of an employer's responsibility?
Growing up as the middle child of three boys, I really only like to talk about three, maybe four things, money, religion, politics, and sports. That's why I haven't been invited to a party in nearly 40 years. But I think it's important though that there are taboo subjects in society. Money, religion, and politics are three of those taboo subjects. But as we think about our role as a CEO, our role as an employer, there's literally nothing that's more important to your employees, to your team members, than being financially secure. Having physical safety, having safety for your family, obviously that's critically important, probably the most important. But right after that, 1B is financial security. And we don't talk about that as a society. And, the thing that I am so passionate about is, I don't believe anyone can afford not to have financial advice. Literally, the people who need the financial advice the most are people that maybe live in paycheck to paycheck. They're people that are not saving a lot for retirement. If you think about sort of what's happening right now broadly, the tectonic plates of our economy are shifting. We have massive shifts with technology and AI. We have massive shifts in terms of like the global world order and what's happening with trade policy and tariffs and supply chains. There are massive demographic shifts as, the entire world is getting older. Literally, day by day by day, we're living longer. But what we're not doing? We're not saving. We're not saving early enough. We're not saving in the right ways. Literally, I don't care who you are or what company you run. This is a massive, massive issue for your employees. When people don't feel financially secure, they're going to resist and be fearful and not adopt some of the latest AI technology, right? If the society is not moving forward and we're not adapting and we're not learning and we're not growing, there's going to be massive segments of the workforce that are literally not going to be qualified to do the jobs of tomorrow. That's going to impact every business in America, every business around the world. And so what I think that we as employers have to do is we have to lean in, maybe not on politics, maybe not on religion, but certainly on money. We have to encourage all of our employees to get an advisor, to get financial advice, to have a budget, to manage debt, to accumulate and save assets, to address risks like life insurance and like retirement, market risks, mortality, morbidity. These kinds of things are massive for the employees. And what I have found, and I have the blessing of working with some of the best and brightest financial security professionals literally in the world, what I've found is that employers who do that, they have the ability to absorb the shocks that come. So whether it's COVID, whether it was 9/11, the financial collapse of 2007 and 8, the future issue every country in the world is going to have around dealing with debt. These things are going to shift. But if you have more employees that are more financially secure because they have advice, they have a budget, they have a plan, they're going to be able to withstand some of the volatility. They will be more secure, and study after study has shown they're going to be more productive. So I don't think this notion of financial advice and encouraging employees and providing them with resources, I don't think it's optional anymore. Not the way the world is changing. I think we have to do it. It's not only an imperative from a moral standpoint to care for the people who are on your team. I also think it's a competitive advantage for CEOs to really lean in and companies to lean in and make sure that their employees have the advice to be financially secure.
You raise such an important point around this. And even if you think back to, say, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where people's individual feeling of safety and security is foundational. And without that feeling of safety and security, they find it difficult to tap into other areas of potential. And so what you're saying from this perspective makes a lot of sense, that when employees can take more of a responsibility in helping their team members, their employees, to have a plan around their own personal finances, it better prepares them for those unexpected but somewhat inevitable challenges, whether it is, political, whether it is financial, like whatever is happening at a global scale, they are better prepared to be able to deal with it. And one of the things that you just touched on was how this pertains to productivity. Could you speak more to what you've seen in the correlation between employee financial security and increased productivity in the workplace?
Yeah, there are lots of studies that show that financially secure employees are 50, 60% more productive than not, people that have the savings. And so that's a big part of it. And your Maslow's hierarchy of needs is exactly right. Every human being has what they call a reptilian brain, right? Fear or flight. And if you don't feel secure, then you're going to be more likely to access that reptilian part of your brain. But if you do feel secure, if you feel confident, if you have and your family has the financial shock absorbers to be able to withstand, hey, maybe AI takes over a segment of jobs. It seems more likely than not it will. And what is the process by which your family is going to and you're going to retrain and learn and grow, and what happens in the intervening period between when the employee loses their job and when they get back into the workforce fully retrained? Like, that is a huge issue that we're just not talking about globally. That's going to have a massive impact. So the ability for employees and team members to do that is going to be a function of, have they consistently saved more than they've spent? Do they have financial cushion? And, the other kind of massive issue that we're seeing is people across the world are not ready for retirement. The pressure that the public sector safety net is going to go under is going to be massive. In the United States, Social Security, which is the number one source of retirement income for all Americans, goes insolvent in 2032 or 2033. If nothing is done on Social Security, it's an across-the-board pay cut for existing retirees of 25%. People like my mother, half of my mother's income comes from Social Security. She's also got a pension. So that's half of her income is looking at a 25% reduction. That is a meaningful amount of reduction. So I don't think that's possible to happen, but to make that whole, it's a $4, $5, $6 trillion cost. And the United States is already carrying a massive debt, $38 trillion and growing literally by the second. I use United States as an example. We could go to France where literally they were rioting in the streets to increase the retirement age by a year or two. So these issues are real. They're no longer like on the horizon. They're going to be compounded by AI and technology, which will impact every job across the planet. And so what do we as a society do about that? The best thing that we can do is every CEO, every employer has to really care for and talk about the importance of financial planning with their employees. They have to encourage them to get a financial advisor. They have to encourage them and provide resources so that they can have it. Because these are huge issues that are going to affect millions and millions of people. And we just have to be part of the solution as CEOs, as leaders of companies. We have to be part of the solution to encourage more people to get the financial advice they need so that whatever happens in the future, they'll be prepared.
And one of the things that you touched on is, with the aging demographic, global, these systemic issues that we're seeing with AI, like what do you believe from your perspective is going to be the kind of leadership that is going to be the most impactful to drive this forward and to really see this start to shift in a meaningful way?
Well, I do think that one of the things that we're really focused on is how can public policy encourage the right behaviors? And, I know you asked about leadership. I think part of leadership is, okay, we know there's a problem. What's the solution, right? Everybody can talk about problems. Real leaders help figure out what the solution is. And, I think that public policy has to encourage the behavior that we know will help more people. And so, we think that we have to encourage holistic financial planning that addresses risk, that helps people budget, that helps people save more than they spend. We think public policy can actually play a vital role in opening up access to financial advice. And that can be a spark, right? It's not a defining answer, but it can be a spark to help elevate this critical issue in the minds of more leaders so that they too lean in and say, you know what, we need to help our employees. We need to help them think about their responsibility to help save and plan for the future. There's virtually no companies today, private sector companies anyway, that are providing defined benefit plans. The risk all goes to the employee. So again, I think between public policy and the private sector, we have to encourage more people to lean in, to think about how they're managing their finances. We need to elevate the conversation so that money is not one of the taboo topics. We need to talk about it. We need to talk about how powerful that savings can be. In the United States, they just passed a big tax bill earlier this year. They created these new things, after the president who's good at naming things. So every child that's born of American citizen after January 1st, 2026 will get $1,000 put in one of these accounts. Laura, you know how much that $1,000, if left in the account and they leave it alone for 65 years, you know how much that $1,000 will turn into?
How much?
$490,000.
Wow.
There's 5% of the U.S. citizens who have access and who participate in a 401k have $500,000 or more in their savings account. So again, that is an example. It's not the only thing, right? That we still need people to take personal responsibility. Of $490,000 in 65 years is not $400,000 today. So this is just an example of public policy being a spark, and it opens up the opportunity for employers to contribute to that. And that's where, again, now we need to also help people not spend it. Because you know what that $1,000 is in 18 years, it's $6,000. So you get the benefit of compound interest if you hold and save money over a long period of time. And that's why, Albert Einstein called compound interest the eighth wonder of the world. But
Mm.
it requires people to have financial acumen. It requires them to have a plan. It requires them to save more than they spend. Culturally, this is essential for us. And I think that's really what we have to do. So like going back to your question about leadership, leadership's all about identifying the right solutions and then leaning in hard. And I think public policy, I think education, and I think having that kind of spirit that we have to care for our team members, our employees, our customers. We've got to all lean in and help people be better and do the financial planning they need to be secure.
Absolutely. And that's such a powerful insight. So thank you for sharing that. Marc, we have a tradition here at CEO Behind the Scenes. We love to wrap up all of our interviews with the same signature questions. So the first question I have for you is, what is one thing that you've changed your mind about recently and why?
What is one thing I've changed my mind about recently and why? Well, I could give you a really thoughtful, philosophical, evolution of my thinking, but I actually am going to go with, I think, rooting for the Dallas Cowboys. I mean, they've just been absolutely terrible. I mean, just terrible lately. And, you got to go back 30 plus years. So I'm not quite there in terms of I have been rooting for them my entire life. But gosh, it is hard to watch them play. Give me some more time. I'll come up with a better, more philosophical answer, but at least that's the one that comes to mind.
The loyalty is getting tested, it sounds like.
For sure.
What's one thing that you've not changed your mind about, a belief that you'd want to leave behind for others to lead or live better?
Well, for me, one of the non-negotiables is my faith. I have, I was blessed to marry somebody with deep faith. My wife, Jennifer, most important person in my life and has been for the better part of 30 plus years. But, what I've found over the course of the last, 10 or 15 years in particular is that, so often we measure ourselves based on how other people see us. And, I think I probably did that my entire, mostly petulant adult life. And, if you have something that grounds you that is, sort of immovable, and this notion that I believe at least that, God loves all of us and he has a plan for all of us. And it sort of helps you weather whatever storm is happens to come in that particular moment. So the importance of faith, I think, is a bedrock in my life, and the importance of family. We all do this for a reason, right? I don't, get up every day and work and drive and do all that stuff just to have self-fulfillment. There's a bigger calling. Yes, I do it, because I want to maximize the gifts I've been giving and the impact I have on others. But the family component to it is absolutely essential. So hopefully, if you have me back at some point here in the future, that answer, the Cowboys answer, was kind of lame, I'll admit. But that answer on things that are immovable in my life, my faith and my family, I don't think that will ever change.
Faith, family, and financial security. What a way to wrap up this conversation. Marc, it has been such a pleasure and privilege to have you on the show with me today. I've absolutely loved this conversation and hearing about your perspective around all things to do with leadership, responsibility, change, financial security, the future. It's been a really insightful conversation. So thank you so much for joining me.
Laura, thanks so much for having me. I enjoyed every second of it.
Likewise. And to our audience, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to subscribe, rate, and review the show. And also share this episode with someone who you know will deeply value and gain so much from Marc's shares and wisdom today. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time on CEO Behind the Scenes.